Welcome everybody back to the second part of the public conversation on the Black Notebooks, what Heidegger's Dehntagebuch reveals about his thought during the Nazi regime. We have this evening that we co-present together with the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I want to thank Roger for doing this with us. We have again Peter Trawny here on the panel. He's the editor of the volumes in question tonight, and a professor of philosophy at the Belgische Universität in Wuppertal. And then I want to present a new panelist for this second part. Welcome Babette Babich. She's a philosopher at Fordham University. She's published widely on Nietzsche, Heidegger, Adorno, and Hölderlin, all people that we've talked. I think except like Adorno we haven't mentioned yet, but the others we have mentioned.
We'll get to it.
She's also worked on aesthetics and including music and philosophy of music and so on and so forth. The panel will be moderated by Roger Berkowitz. He's the academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center of Politics and Humanities and associate professor of politics, human rights, and philosophy at Bard College. So enjoy the second part of this evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Menzel and also to the Goethe Institute for co-sponsoring with us this event with us. And it is an event, something that in philosophy we don't always have, though in Heideggerian philosophy we sometimes do. This has caused a lot of interest outside of typical Heideggerian and philosophical circles. I'm glad you're all here, and I hope that for those of you who are here for the first panel and the first event, the conversation, by putting up a number of citations, a number of quotes, the effort was there to show you actually what is being said in these books and to provide us some text and some concrete thoughts upon which to ask this question. And I think there are a number of questions that at this point are on the table. One was Heidegger an anti-Semite in his personal life? And I don't think there's much doubt at this point that at least at times and in certain places he was. And there's not much sense in revisiting that, although if there are questions we can later. There is then the question of, is Peter Trawny right? Insofar as he says that his anti-Semitism is primarily, except for a couple of these stereotypes, primarily a spiritual and philosophical form of anti-Semitism, one that is related to his science-geschichtliche Denken and his thinking about the fates, the fated history of being. And then the third question is he right a second time, in which when he says that the fact that his anti-Semitism is primarily related to this spiritual, intellectual, science-geschichtliche Denken, is that mean that it corrupts his general philosophy about the loss of the rootedness of modernity? Or is that thinking still meaningful and valid, and can it be discussed without the worry of it being rooted in a kind of anti-Semitic idea? So I understand that was some of the questions and way that we were talking about in the first program. Babette Babich has joined us now, and I thought maybe we'd begin by giving her an opportunity to respond to some of what Peter and I were talking about earlier, and then he'll respond, and then we'll get going.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Actually, I don't like the question whether I am right. I just want to say that actually that's not the point. It's just I give an interpretation of these passages, and that's my interpretation. Of course, I'm responsible for this interpretation, but I guess that the discussion shouldn't be whether I am right or not, but whether how we could deal, we can deal with these passages. And this is just to say that it's, you know, that in Germany we have this discussion that people are giving, like me, giving interviews, and other people giving interviews. They are apologists of Heidegger, and it seems to be a discussion who is right, and that's not the point. We have these black notebooks, and we have these passages in it, and the question is how can we deal with it? So that actually, that just I want to say.
Well said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very
That's
much.
bad.
I wanted to start by thanking. I want to thank Roger Berkowitz and the Goethe Institute for hosting this, because it is not usual that one pays attention to a significant event in the book publishing world, and that is something that's significant, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you. My second thanks is also to Peter, because by editing these books, you bring them to us, and that's actually a great contribution. Editors, I'm an editor. In addition to the books I write, I also edit. That's a thankless thing. You disappear. You're not usually mentioned. So the editor tends to disappear behind the author, and sometimes even behind the important person who writes the preface. So being an editor, or the big editor who actually runs the series and does nothing. So editing is a thankless task, and yet the editor is the one who comes into the closest connection with the work. In the case of Nietzsche, you mentioned Nietzsche, that would have been his sister. She unfortunately edited the Goethe power, which was not so great. She has the copyright to that, but she owns it. But most editors vanish. I don't think that's going to be the case here. So this is great news, one thing, and I'm sure that Posterman is also really happy too. I'm only speaking as someone who was listening, therefore, as the first, if you like, questioner among questioners. And one of the things that, since Peter says who's right, who's wrong, but that automatically writes me accidentally into the position of a Heidegger apologist. And that's sort of awful, because that means I have to say, sorry, I write on Heidegger. And I don't know how right that is, because apologetics, we know from Socrates and the Apology, is really a matter of answering the charge that someone has posed. And as Socrates pointed out, you have no idea where all the charges are. Roger would know, that's the law. You just don't know what you're coming up against. And in the case of this case, you really see a lot of that. There are a lot of things that are scuttled up. Now, one of my teachers was Gadamer, and that matters because that's really someone who learns from Heidegger. So I'm actually a grandchild in that sense. But Gadamer picks up on hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the science, the art, the bothersome business of reading. And really the question is, how do you read? And when it comes to Heidegger, that's just an enormously difficult question. Heidegger's texts are famously obscure. Most of my colleagues think that they're not philosophy at all, simply because they're obscure. These books, if we weren't having a scandal about them, if Peter hadn't pointed and written a very elegant and important book about some of the theses that do emerge, if he hadn't done his hermeneutics, maybe we wouldn't have paid attention to them, because when you have such a prolific author as Heidegger, one book after another, after a while you simply, even if you're a scholar, you stop reading the latest volumes. You don't. I mean, I worked a lot on the Beiträge, and the Besinnung, a volume many of us haven't read, appeared. I bought it and never read it, because I thought that's enough. Otherwise, and I waited to see if someone else would read it. No one did, so it's unread on that. There were other volumes since then. These 3 volumes I went out and got. I think a lot of scholars have gotten them for their own purposes. One of the things that has to be said about these volumes is that they are vastly better than some of the other volumes of unpublished works. This is actually good stuff, philosophically speaking. So if we were going to go over to Washington Square, and if I, traded in drugs, which unfortunately I don't, we could say this is good stuff. Compared to the Beiträge, this stuff is worth reading. And that's something I think which is a service, even for the apologists, as well as for the attackers, that is really being done by getting attention to this. This is like, if you're a student of Heidegger, it is like whatever you write on, being able to have a conversation with Heidegger about the topic you find the most fascinating. Maybe it's Geschichte, maybe it's Geschichte. In my case, it would be Die Irre. Richardson, a teacher of mine, writes on that. Heidegger has such discussions on Irre, what it means to be in the Irre, to go in, and of course the human being as fundamentally in the Irre, that everything is either vindicated or destroyed, but it's still a valuable conversation. This is a voice from the grave. So, but that's also the context that I would want to underline. It is highly personal. I think I do agree with people who mentioned that it's highly personal, questions that were asked. I think it's enormously hard to read personal things. I mentioned the will of power. How do you read anybody's work? There is a difference. God was again a good example for me anyway. If God would live forever, didn't die until he was 102, and one of the things that he did was he engaged in Tübingen with the publisher to publish an Ausgabe letzte Hand. And an Ausgabe, that is to say, that is touched, an edition, that is to say, that has been supervised with the direct hand of the author. That was important for him. I think he learned that from Heidegger. Because for Heidegger, and what also strikes me, and here is a real question from Goethe that I am not sure about. I am struck reading this, having read the Beiträge, and I did really read it, I just hated it. But having read the Beiträge and comparing it to these notebooks, my question is, what kind of plan for publication must he have had? That is to say, Heidegger, as you know, the Beiträge itself was published out of the order it should have appeared in. It was a little early because Wolfgang Schirmacher stole a little bit of a text that he shouldn't have stolen from an archive and published it, and he shouldn't have done that. And as a result, his family did damage control. So the Beiträge appeared out of the row of publication. So I'm back to the question of publication history, because Peter, you make much of the fact that this is ordered to a particular place that Heidegger wanted it to have appeared. And that to me is the real question. How do we understand what Heidegger does? Now, I'm not touching the question of world domination and conspiracy and claims about the Jews, because I think those are very, very difficult concepts, and I'm not an expert on such matters. So I'm just looking at the philosophy of Heidegger. And if I look at the philosophy of Heidegger, there's interesting material there. It's worth reading. It's actually so good that it's a shame that the only reason one is reading it is because of this. It's like reading pornography when you're young, and you don't, and it's great literature because that's all you know about, and you just look for the racy bits. At the end of the day, you really haven't read the book. So I'm thinking that is one of the problems. If we just read this looking for anti-Semitism, it's 3 volumes, these are 3 books. There may be something that gets thrown out. Maybe justly, and maybe that's what we want to do, but I think all of these people are here, first of all, because it's interesting about philosophy of the scandal, and secondly, because maybe there's something interesting about Heidegger. So those are preliminary. Just preliminary.
Yeah.
Remarks.
Yeah.
Just remarks. You know.
No, yeah. I never said that this is that the manuscripts are not interesting and that they are not very, very interesting. They are indeed very interesting, and everybody should read them. And it's and indeed the black notebooks are giving a new dimension of texts to the whole Heideggerian corpus. So that's very in this sense it's very interesting to see that he certainly planned at first to publish the lecture courses and the more popular stuff and his own publications like Off the Beaten Track and so on, and then he decided to see publishing because it was dead. Being historical manuscripts, they are more esoteric already, and at the end probably we have the most esoteric manuscripts, namely the the black notebooks. But we already knew from the being historical manuscripts that the black notebooks are very important because he is referring everywhere to the black notebooks, even in the contributions and so on. We have always have references to the black notebooks. So we knew that they are very important for himself, and now we have them, and now we see we have manuscripts with a totally new style we didn't know before. It's a new tone in this. So it's an adventure to read them. You are totally right. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say that. I could not say that. That I just to tell about my experience when I edited them. Well, suddenly you have a passage about Jews and an anti-Semitic passage. You never had something like this in his philosophical context. You think, well, interesting. You of course you have passages about Hölderlin, you have about Nietzsche, you have about Bolshevism, about Americanism, but everything is well known, and you see that of course it's interesting, but it's well known. It's the time of the Nietzsche lecture courses and so on. Nietzsche is very important, and he speaks a lot about Nietzsche, of course, so it's okay. And then suddenly one passage about the Jews. You think, well, that's new. And then comes, and then you think, okay, whatever he has, that's strange. And then suddenly you have the second, then you have the third, and you have the fourth, and you have the sixth, and then you think, what the hell actually? Why is he doing this? And in this point, I guess you cannot say, let's read 200 pages, and let's take time, let's discuss the next 10 years about it. If you really have this hot stuff there about world Jewry, I guess you cannot ignore it in this point. That you can say, yeah, you need probably 3 years or 4 years to understand what he is writing there. I didn't want to do that at this point, because I was as an editor, I thought that you cannot edit this, you cannot publish it, and then say, yeah, well, let's look what will happen. Let's take time. I don't think that this is possible. Why is it possible? Because you have, of course, for instance, many Jewish students by Heidegger. You have many Jewish thinkers, philosophers like Levinas, like Derrida, like other, of course, I'm Arendt, but from the younger generation, for instance, Derrida and Levinas. And it was always a question how to deal with his silence, for instance, about the Shoah. It was always a big topic in the Heideggerian discussion. It was always something we had to recognize, that he kept silent about the Holocaust and so on. And if you have the background of this discussion, you cannot say that, well, at first I had the concepts are so strange. World Jewry is actually not a strange concept. It's well known actually. So I think it's not very hard to understand what this means. So at this point, I think that it was quite clear that this discussion is necessary. The discussion is necessary. I don't want to say that the result is clear, but the discussion, I guess, is quite necessary, and therefore I thought that I cannot ignore it at this point.
I'm glad that you did it, but I'm a Nietzschean, and Nietzscheans are rather used to this, because Nietzsche says terrible things about the Jews. He also says terrible things about women, he also says terrible things about the English. He's not fond of them either. So I'm used to it. It's how do you read a philosophy and bracket terrible things is a problem. We would often like to think that philosophers are picture book icons, and they're not in lots of ways, and it's hard for us. And yet at the same time, we want to get close to them. We want to know who they are. We'd like to know. I mean, for me, Heidegger was already bad because of all the love affairs he had, you know. And I'm not as bad about Hannah Arendt because they were friends. To me, that's the test. Did they stay friends? And that matters to me. But he was a philanderer. He was a terribly unfaithful man. And one can say, well, that's an achievement, but I'm not sure. You know, I speak from 50% of the human race. And Nietzsche thinks that you should keep your promises. But that's another point. So I'm used to the question of very unappetizing statements, and these are certainly those. But I'm still wanting to say that when I say this is hot stuff and this is why we're here, we're not here for any of the other things. I mean, I have a little book that I brought along from someone who did know about these things, Sylvia Vieta, Heidegger's critique of National Socialism and technology. Now, Vieta himself is also someone who knows the Black Notebooks and someone who wrote about the Black Notebooks indirectly, of course, but he wrote about technology. So one of the things, and you talked about that, that's a really fascinating question. We talk about calculation, or Markenschaft, or this whole question of what it is to get a number on things, or to be in control of things. That's also where we are in the world today. So we're still measuring, is the climate really that bad? Should we change our lives? Should we not? Can we continue business as usual? So to a certain extent, if we turn this into a discussion solely about that question, which is an important question, then we may lose some of the other things that he is saying. And that's why I say I'm not an expert, because I am not an expert in the time of Germany. I'm not a historian, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, and I really don't know how quite to understand that. I do know that contextually, people speak differently and use terms in a different way at a certain point in time. When I went to school, some of my teachers used terms to talk about black people that they no longer use, and that are completely unacceptable. If we had a text where that was recorded, those people, many of whom were good people, but those were terms that were used. We can't use them today. They used to be the correct terms. Justices in the Supreme Court use those terms. So one does have to think a little bit about that. And the term I'm using is really Negro, in case you were thinking of another word. But even that, so it's a question that we ourselves are now super careful not to use. If I teach, I don't say it. No, I say black people, as one should.
Do you have a...
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that you know that it's not the point of political correctness. That's not the point, actually. As I said before, I would deal with Nietzsche's perspectives on the Jews as the origin of the slavish morality, for instance. I would say I would have a different perspective on this as compared to the Heideggerian ideas in this time, where, like I said before, where we see the beginning of the persecution, and not the beginning, where we see the persecution and where we see the beginning of the Holocaust. And Heidegger knew of it. That's something different, I guess. And there is a certain responsibility to react to this difference. And there, in hermeneutics, I guess, we also have this responsibility where we have to say, no, this is a point we cannot contextualize anymore. If for instance, after the war, if he says that the destruction of Germany is a result of Jewish politics, then you can say that this is a point where no hermeneutics can rescue this view, and there is a responsibility to say, no, that is impossible. Heidegger, you cannot say that. You cannot say that the Jews, 12 years the Jews destroyed Germany. You cannot say that. You cannot contextualize it. You cannot say, well, let's see what are terms here. Well, let's think 2 years about this term, and then maybe we have something. No, there's a point where you can say, no, even if you are the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, this is over the limit, I guess.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that needs to be said.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the great shames, I think, of the period that you're talking about with his Jewish students and these conversations is that people sort of said, well, yeah, maybe, I don't know, but I don't want to know, right? You know, it's clear from many sources, Arendt's letters to Jasper's letters to Arendt, other people's letters, and now the Schwarzenhefte, that Heidegger, you know, maybe even more than just traded in stereotypes. Yeah, it was inconsistent, and as many human beings are inconsistent. But he certainly was an anti-Semite in certain relations at certain times, and we should not run away from that. I think that's absolutely imperative that we say that. And I think, from my point of view, one of the great virtues of your book and these discussions are to force people to take seriously the fact that Heidegger was this in certain ways, and then to try and not end the conversation there. And I think it's important for you to say, you know, not whether you're right or wrong, you're trying to have a conversation. I think that's deeply important. But the conversation that you've turned us to, which I fundamentally agree with, is one of the corruption or non-corruption of his work. And let me try and put it this way. It strikes me that at times in your book, and at times in the way you've spoken, you've suggested that his anti-Semitism is really problematic on the level of ideas, Geist, and that it's not really a matter of blood and race, and maybe there was these issues and he was an anti-Semite, but that's not what's really an issue. And yet, at times you then suggest that this intellectual or spiritual anti-Semitism corrupts, infects, is a language that contaminates the medical languages used. His attempt to think about the history of being, his attempt to talk about us, our time in which we talk about humans as human resources, our time in which we talk about the earth as simply something to be mined, etc. And that on the one hand, you acknowledge that this comes out of Descartes, and this comes out of his reading of modernity, and I would suggest it goes all the way back to his reading of Plato and the movement from aletheia to orthos in his idea of truth and the mathematical idea of truth in the Platonic dialogues. But regardless of that, it has a history and an impact much greater than Judaism. And yet there are moments in your book in which you suggest that the question of Judaism may be and probably is deeply central to his philosophy. And I think that's an important question to raise, but I also think it's important to ask for some clarity in an answer, in the sense of, you know, simply raising the question and saying, well, that's it, in the public discourse at least, has a way of answering it in the sense of it is infected. And I guess I'd like more clarity from you as to how seriously you think it is infected and where.
Yeah, well, well, the philosophical question is maybe, of course, that's okay, that's not clear. is quite clear that the topic of world Judaism or world Jewry or whatever appears in his context of his reading of modernity, of what it means, what modern existence means. For instance, the problem of universalism. That's I guess is the philosophical reading that he has enormous problems at the end of the 30s to understand what actually is universalism. His only possibility to understand universalism is technology and mathematics. These are his key accesses to this problem. And he attacks this kind of universalism because, of course, he is still loyal to the Germans. He has this Herderlinian concept of the Germans. He has still this idea of the world historical task of the Germans, and so on. So for him, everything is what is universal in the sense of mathematics and technology is in a certain way an enemy, and really a an enemy in the war, because he thinks that America, for instance, the Bolshevism are representatives of this kind of universalism. And this is, of course, in a philosophical way, quite weak of concept of universalism to read it as a form of mathematics and technology. In my eyes, it's weak. On an analytical level, it's not so weak, because globalization, you can say, is in a certain way has one of its origins in a certain economy and in a certain concept of technology. But nevertheless, when it comes to this point that he says the main representative of this style of living, of this style of existence, is the Jew. I said it before, but if this could be one possible reading in this time of these passages, then maybe we would have to ask we would have to discuss this kind of critique of modernity again. And maybe, and this is the next step, the philosophical step, maybe we should ask, or we should think about our critique of modernity, whether we still have, in a certain way, arguments referring to this kind of thinking or this kind of stereotypes. So in a certain way, the only philosophical question is how much are we still anti-Semites? but this would be the end of the discussion. Not the beginning, but this could be one of the conclusions, or this could be one of the ways to philosophize this whole concept. But this is not, of course, our task here.
Can I push you just a little bit on that last point? You had raised a question, and I think it was a very important one, that you have a different style than Heidegger here. And I think that really gets my attention. What I'm curious about with regard to the passages that you're referring to is the contradiction that you point to when I'm talking about. I'm wondering about, and that's why I say I think that there is a lot more to say about this, and we need to talk more about it. It's leaked, I can repeat that, I mean, I think it's very complicated what it means. So here the question is, how can one understand the criticism of the calculative strengths of the Jews historically? Can one not, or could one not consider that rhetorically, given the fact that Nazism as a movement is not exactly anti-technology? In fact, we Americans profited a great deal from some of the technologies that were developed under Nazism. So I'm wondering if Heidegger isn't saying this mode.
He is saying that the two most powerful representatives of technology are the National Socialists and the Jews. That's what he's saying. And therefore we can say, well, and therefore they have to find themselves. Therefore they have to destroy themselves because they are slaves of technology, both.
Okay. Well, the political theorist in Canada, whom I like a lot, who doesn't get read a lot, is a fellow named Graham Nicholson, who wrote a nice little article called "In Führerführung," to lead the leader. And he really thought that Heidegger's whole idea in his fantasy making is to rule National Socialism. And that's why I'm curious about this stuff.
To rule?
Yeah, to rule, to control it, to direct it, that it seemed to not really have good sense. And if he could put it on the right track, there would be all kinds of advantages. This is of course absurd. You know, this is like writing tweets to Obama. Hey, what about this? You know?
We say it's absurd, and yet, I mean, to me, these 3 volumes that you've edited, the revelation that I came away from, if there is one, or the thing that I found most shocking and interesting in my reading, was precisely this, that in much of Heidegger's work, and we do this, there's references in Volkswagen, as someone pointed out, to that kind of a geistige, or a grand idea of National Socialism. You have here in 1,200 pages worked out a grand idea of National Socialism over and over again. It is an attempt to articulate a spiritual, and as you, I think, rightly put it, unique and not blood-related view of National Socialism. That itself is a shock when you read these works, at least as I read them. Much more so than the anti-Semitic passages, which were short and I thought unclear. The attempt to put a political, strong manifestation of the idea that there can be a new beginning of philosophy in the German Reich that he develops in these years is, I think, something that those of people who are in Heidegger research are going to have to deal with and must deal with. Not in any kind of, oh my God, he's a Nazi way, because I think he is a Nazi, and yet he's a Nazi in a different way than other people were Nazis. But it's part of his philosophy. It's also true that while he never gives up, as far as I understand it, National Socialism as a grand idea, he does give up the idea of the Germans as the place of a new beginning in his work post, I don't know what the exact date is, but certainly 1944 or 45. And so I guess I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. I think that's, to me, the sort of really, that's what I want to deal with in reading these books, is what does it mean that we now have 1,200 pages of him trying to articulate what he means by the grandiosity of National Socialism.
You're right. That's of course that's in this books. It's much more present as anti-Semitism. That's no question. But at this point I cannot. Like I said, in a certain way, I would repeat myself if I say that. What he really is trying to figure out, or what he is really performing in the books, has a very small reference to this, what really is happening in Germany there. And he's always dealing with it, that he is so unique, and his kind of thinking is so unique that nobody, really, literally nobody, can understand him. And this is in a certain way a very a big gap between somebody who tries to deal with the philosophy of National Socialism, whether this is possible or not, I don't know, whether there could be a philosophy of spiritual National Socialism. But when he is dealing with this on the one hand, on the other hand, he sees that there is actually nobody he can really speak with about it, because nobody really is is reading Hölderlin like reading. Nobody really is reading. Not at all. Yeah, and this is strange, that you have always this great dimension of the greatness of the Germans, and that he is trying to figure out what it does mean that the Germans has to be so great. And then he comes back and says, well, this hymn of Hölderlin must be read now. And you think that, well, how can he manage this this gap? So this is the strange experience in reading these books for me in this point.
I'm going to then ask a question to both of you, unless you want to say something to this. Do you want to respond to this? I'm going to ask one last question to both of you for the same question, and then we'll throw it open to questions, and we'll have some good time for questions. Yeah, it's also getting hot. Both of you, I'm sure, know that in his denazification writing in 1945, he said, just ask anyone who was in my courses during the 30s, and they'll tell you I was against the Nazis. I was not a Nazi. And one has to ask themselves, well, what are these books? How do these books help us evaluate that statement? The statement usually, as I understand it, is interpreted to read in his analysis of the Jews and the Nazis as the epitome of mahajab, or technique, and the Nazis thus as the betrayal of the new Anfang, the new beginning. What you have is the final victory of the dehumanization of man, the creation of even man into what he calls Bestand, having no stand, having no opposition to, and being completely disposable for whatever plan or purpose it is. And so if you take his reinterpretation of his work through this time, he's, in his attempts to think about a spiritual National Socialism and a vulgar National Socialism, he's trying to argue that the Nazis were a vulgar, as I understand it, National Socialism, and one that actually contributed to the dehumanization and to the possibility of things like the Holocaust. Right? That's how I understand his self-interpretation. If that's clear, I hope so. I'd like to know what both of you think these texts do to our evaluation of his defense, his self-defense. You want to go first, Babette? Or do you have or is it a meaning? Can we ask? Do they provide us an answer? Or do they provide us an entree into answering that question?
I want to wait. I'm hoping very much that Goethe lets go of the notebook, because I feel that it would be good to see the fourth volume. That's what I think it would be good. He has one.
Can you speak into the mic, speak into your mic?
That is to say, we're missing one still, and one of the worries that I have is really it's like the Game of Thrones. I'm waiting for the next episode. It hasn't been written, it hasn't been published.
Yeah.
And that's a worry that I have, because I can't really answer
It
it.
comes at the end of the year. Yeah.
Good, thankfully. And so without it,
You've read it.
Yeah, I've read it.
so you can tell us, but so that would be for me the precondition, because I think it has to complexify things. The point you make, Roger's fantastic, as it really says, he's got this deposition, he's really trying to defend himself. Jaspers stares into pieces with the Gutachten. I mean, if you have a friend like Jaspers, you don't need an enemy. And at the end of the day, he's stripped from any right to have anything to do with teaching and representation of the new Germany. He was not regarded as someone they wanted on the new team. And most, in fact, every single other rector was. So to me, that's sort of fascinating when you look at the history. So that's really about the history being complicated. So I think when you go back and you look at his statement and you read these can help us understand to what extent. I think you can also see it by reading his Nietzsche lectures. I think you do see that he's taking a distance, but it's a distance of a Heideggerian distance. This is not the kind of thing most of us would recognize, and that's something that I think is maybe unfortunate. So Pedro, you probably have a good point by saying, And Beryl Lamb already said this a long time ago, you know, he's kind of to blame that people could misuse him, that even with the strongest apologetics that were given, people misused his statements. For Lamb, a very good point is that in a certain sense, if you write in an opaque way, and people then opaquely take your opaque statements and do terrible things with them, it's a little bit your fault. And I agree with Lamb's point about that. At the same time, since Lamb hates Heidegger, I think that some of that opacity isn't really there. I think that we read Heidegger very quickly. And I think if you slow down your pace when you're reading him, if you pretend that Heidegger was a guy who almost became a Jesuit, and you recognize that this is someone who means every single word he says, and you go slow enough to read each word, suddenly it's not opaque anymore. And that, I think, is something we want to keep in mind. He's not as opaque if you read him slowly. And so, to a certain extent, the work is still there to be done. So I think it complexifies it, and I think it will probably not vindicate him for people like Beryl Lamb, but it may open our eyes, and I think it will open our eyes, especially to those of us who read Adorno, because I think the way we can understand the way Heidegger talks about culture in these notebooks, to me, is the way in 1944 Horkheimer and Adorno also talk about culture. It is not my fault that the Adorno people hate the Heidegger people and vice versa. It's nonetheless the case that historically, at that time, the word culture works for them in the same way. And that's not a random creative notion. That's just a fact of time, of a matter of time. They were using the word in a similar way.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, it's complex. So that's true. I guess that we see that Heidegger is criticizing in a certain way National Socialism, one mode of it, one kind of this National Socialism. That's quite clear, and I think that the Nietzsche lecture courses are good examples. But even the notebooks we have very massive critical attacks to a certain kind of National Socialism. But nevertheless, one has to say that there is a basic loyalty which remains until the end. And this basic loyalty is, I guess, for Heidegger very existential, because he saw that he was risking very much when he put all his cards on this narrative of the first and the other beginning of the Greeks and the Germans. He knew that this is a philosophical risk he took, and he knew that at this point where this Third Reich would fail, his project will be in danger. And then this is quite clear, and like you said, because he couldn't, in 1952, he couldn't make a lecture course about Hölderlin as the Germans, the most German of the Germans. That was over with 45 and 46. So he saw that his I guess his main, this is my interpretation, but his main philosophical project, because I guess that he thought that this actually is his project, not being in time a certain day, but this, the first and the other beginning, that this project was immediately connected with the political situation. And then he had to invent himself again after 45, 40, 46, 47, and he began to invent himself. He began to use other concepts. For instance, Euro. It wasn't there, or Abendland. I don't know how you translate that. It must be evening land. Actually, it must be translated literally because he wants to hear this Abend, the evening, and so on, land of the evening or whatever. He uses different concepts, and then he's shifting his whole project with these new concepts. But this was for him a hard new beginning, and he had a great comeback. He was actually the best of all these conservative persons compared to Schmidt. Schmidt hadn't had a good comeback.
He does not.
No, not in the, even still in the academic situation in Germany, you can actually not give a seminar about Carl Schmitt. It's still no.
We can.
Yeah, you are. You can send a tweet to Barack Obama. When I was shocked about this insight into the democracy, I thought
We're not supposed to. It's a waste of a tweet.
Yeah, really? And I thought it was way.
He has people who read the tweets.
Okay, so yeah, that's fine. This is the point. So now, so this is, I guess, this is the most, I guess, the most important thing that you see that Heidegger really, that his main philosophical project was actually failing with Hitler in a certain way, and this is something, yeah, of course, this is something problematic in a certain way, I would say. So this is, but of course not in a certain sense, in a certain philosophical sense. So
We have half an hour, and we have a lot of people here. So we're going to take a couple questions. Please keep your questions respectful, brief, and ask questions. And let's just go right here next to you. You speak into the mic, please.
Okay. My name is Henry Lothar, and I want to make a point about anti-Semitism. I think Heidegger's anti-Semitism is a pornographic issue. It raises a lot of stimulation, titillation, but it's not the important issue. To me, as a Jew, I'm not offended by it.
I agree.
Number one. Number two, I would like to compare it to the anti-Semitism of Carl Gustav Jung.
Jung. No.
C.G. Jung.
Oh, Jung.
Jung, who was also a womanizer, who got pornographic fame because of Sabina Spielrein, unfairly so, because she didn't sleep with him. But he also espoused Hitler and the Nazis when he became the director of the psychotherapy in Germany. So I would like to suggest that we separate anti-Semitism from Nazism. Now, when the occupation forces examined Heidegger, they called him a Mitläufer, which is the lowest category. So I think this was simply opportunism, that he went with the Nazism because he thought it would advance his political career. And I think a philosopher has no business being a politician anyway. So you mentioned many of his Jewish students. His teacher was a Jew. Anton Husserl was a converted Jew, number one. So I don't think that the anti-Semitism is an influence on his philosophy. The anti-Semitism was as common as the dirt. I mean, everyone in the world is anti-Semitic. As long as you know Jews, they have to be anti-Semites. Same as with the blacks. It's a race issue, period.
Okay.
Now, I want to make one more point.
Very good.
I submit, and I'd like to test it with you, Professor Trawny. Heidegger read Mein Kampf. His identification with the Nazis is through Mein Kampf, nothing else. There were also Nazi philosophers. There was Krieg, there was Boimler, and there was Rosenberg. So to me, the enigma is how a sophisticated man like Heidegger could identify with these vulgar Nazi philosophers and work with them. That's to me the problem.
okay, yeah. That's a historical question. He didn't. He despised them. That's quite clear. He despised the Krieg and Rosenberg, and that's quite clear. So he made a great difference between him and these normal national socialist philosophers. So that's quite clear. Yeah.
Could you address the claim that his entire interest in National Socialism was through Mein Kampf? Because you disagree with that in your book, as far as I understand your book.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't really speak about it.
He read Mein Kampf, I guess, and well, we have proofs of this, and I think that he didn't think that this was a great book. Of course not. But who? But nevertheless, is it really important who read Mein Kampf or who not? I guess probably Goethe didn't read Mein Kampf. But
You also read Mein Kampf.
What?
He also read Mein Kampf.
I don't know, but maybe somebody like I don't know.
There is one topos.
All the National Socialists read Mein Kampf.
Let me tell you there is one topos about Jews being a nomadic people, Asiatic, therefore without culture. And this is something which Jung talks about and Heidegger talks about.
Yeah.
And this is a Hitler idea from Mein Kampf.
I don't know whether this is a Hitler.
It is. I read Mein Kampf. In Germany, Mein Kampf.
Yeah, I know. But I don't know whether this really is the origin of this anti-Semite or whatever idea. And by the way, I'm of course not a specialist in research of anti-Semitism.
Okay, we'll go on.
Yeah.
Move on to the next question. In the back there, or right there.
I want to make some points, and then I want to draw a conclusion.
Could you put your mic up? Yeah. I'm having trouble hearing you, sir. Bring your mic close.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Early in this proceeding, the equation was made, Americanism equals Bolshevism. This is something that Heidegger believed, right? Anybody who believed that doesn't know a damn thing about politics at all. He was as bad a politician as anybody who ever lived. He made every mistake you could possibly make. Apparently he was hermetically sealed. The second point is, there is a letter that he addressed, something about the 6 million dead people after the war, sometime in the late 40s. And his comment was weird. It was, well, you know, if you look at what's going on in agricultural affairs in southern Germany these days, that's even worse than the 6 million dying. How can he be that disconnected from reality?
Okay.
Right?
That's not an accurate summary of the, it's actually not a letter, it's a text. Do you want to respond?
Okay.
Well, no, that's it's in a lecture, in a so-called Leon lectures, and he says something about technology, and he says that the fabrication of corpses in these camps is the same, dasselbe, he says, like modern agriculture industry, for instance. This is a quote, a thought, an idea about his concept of technology, and we of course we could discuss the tone of this passage. But by the way, fabrication of corpse, Hannah Arendt uses the same words in his book about the elements of the
Origins of intelligence.
Yeah. So But he does not say that whatever catastrophe in agriculture is more important than the fabrication of corpses.
Yeah, please down here.
Peter, you use the term contamination. That's a very strong term. And yes, the term contamination is central to your interpretation here, which means that, contrary to what some people have said, we can't just set it aside, leave it there, and say everything else is just fine. Now, my question, and you have worked on Heidegger for many years, does this contamination work retroactively? And the reason I raise that question is that I've always been inclined to prefer the early Heidegger, just as some people prefer the early Marx, some people prefer the early Hegel, some people prefer the early Husserl. And so, you know, you can look at Heidegger's career and make a very strong distinction between the kind of work that you find in Zeit and that period, and what happens later. And so So my question has always, since I retain my admiration for being in time, does the contamination reach that far? Most of the work that you're discussing here is from the late 30s and 40s.
Yeah. Well, you know that actually in my, there is a second edition of this book of mine, and I'm trying to criticize myself by thinking about this term of contamination. I'm asking myself, of course I have to ask myself whether this all is an exaggeration of these anti-Semitic passages. Is it too strong what I say about it? Is it too too much of what I do with it? I'm asking myself this question. And in this sense, of course, the term of contamination is the most dangerous because one could think, what is then contaminated? Already being in time. For instance, the analysis of the one, the we, das man, is this already something like a prefiguration of the worldlessness of the Jews? I don't know. I would stick to the text, and then if you don't have clear proof there, then I would say that it's not contamination. So I maybe it's a bad term. I just have to rethink it, that's what I can say to this.
Yes.
I'm hoping you can sort of land the plane for us here. Let's say you're right. Contaminated. Contaminated is a good word. Let's say that this whole philosophical project is contaminated by these ideas. So what do you see as kind of following from that?
Kind of following. Yeah, you know that actually I don't want to be right in this point because I'm the director of the Heidegger Institute, and I actually want to be for a long time. So but I had a discussion with a colleague who said that, we discussed these problems, and I said, well, we here at the Institute, we will be very critical with these points. We will discuss that, and he said, that's good, but nevertheless, you cannot be the director of the Adolf Hitler Institute. Because you cannot have this at a German university, and this would be the point. If we would say that everything is in a certain way, that Heidegger really is an anti-Semitic philosopher, then that would be really a catastrophe in a certain way for me. So in this respect, I don't want to be right at this point. And by the way, I do not say that. I say that, for instance, the encounter with Hannah Arendt at the beginning of the 50s, in my view, is very important for his relation to these kind of ideas. And at the end of my book, I say something with Babette was mentioning the importance of the question of, I don't know how you translate it,
Errancy.
About errancy. That my one point of this interpretation is that I say that he knew at the end of his life what was written in these notebooks, and that he was aware of the problems, but that he really that he couldn't be like this to take the pen and to wipe it out, and that he really maybe tries to show us how deeply a philosopher can fail in a certain way. That's actually the last idea of my book. I don't know whether this interpretation really is strong or can be argued for, but I hope so that this could be possible. Well, there is one question in the next volume where he says that maybe the either or already is heresy. You know, he always speaks about decision, and this is one very important term in the 30s, that we have either we are Germans or not, either we are these people or these people or not, and then there's a small question where you ask, perhaps already this either or is heresy, and I hope that this could be a key, but I'm a little bit pessimistic, just to say.
Yes. I hope to pick up on the very good questions that have been asked just now, especially the one about a possible consequence of the idea of contamination taking radically. I too was thinking of Simon's side. Is inauthenticity something Jewish? Is ungenuine authenticity Jewish? And so on. That won't get us very far. That doesn't seem plausible. But there is another consequence that, for me, was very, very plain from the quotation you had on the Word, in which he discusses the violence of the Jewish reaction to the way that they are being treated in Germany. They really ought to know what's happening because they are the inventors of the concept of race. And if the Germans are practicing racial discrimination, well, it's something they've learned. The Anwendung is learned. There's a kind of violence in their using the idea in the first place because the idea is a violent idea. It doesn't come from life. And then the second aggressive application of it is, well, it's only consequential. I'm going to jump in order to shut up very quickly. When you get to the fabrication of corpses, no distinction is made between who does the fabrication and who is the corpse. It's almost a continuation, maybe, of the logic of the passage that we saw, in which the Jew is somehow responsible for his own annihilation because the annihilation occurs through the vigorous application of a concept of racial purity. Right? There's this level, it's atrocious leveling of the responsibility of victim, of the victim inviting his own doom. One sentence to sum up. That passage strikes me as so deranged, and to pick up a phrase we've heard, so alien to a sense of the real. And the Jewish family who sees the father of the family come back from Buchenwald, right? Beaten, traumatized, and ruined, is reacting vigorously against this treatment because the family understands very well that treatment is, after all, what? Appropriate? I understand it very well because we too, discriminate racially and know the concept better than anyone else. Outcome. Read Heidegger critically from now on. And anyone who's capable of that sort of argument cannot be trusted to think. Read Simon's side critically. Are there contradictions? How much comes from Kierkegaard? Is Sein anything other than God? That is the result of the passages that we've seen. I'm sorry, a certain disrespect for the absolute authority of these texts, even read word by word.
Respond to that?
Well, I guess that this passage you remind us is one of the most problematic ones, that the Nazis are in a certain way copying the principle of race from the Jews, and that they are applying what the Jews actually invented. aware of the fact that actually the Jews didn't persecute Germans in the 30s. To my knowledge, I don't know. And that this was another way around, and this is really a strange passage around.
But this was exactly Hitler's idea. He said it in the Reichstag when he took power. Hitler said on January 30th, if the Jews will start the war, we'll exterminate them.
Yeah,
Hitler's
that's not from 1930, that is
1933.
It's later, but this is an interesting quotation because this is, if you're reading the protocols of the Elders of Zion, I just quoted from the book. You can find the idea in these protocols where it's said that if a people is attacking us, the Jews, we can unleash the world war. Right. We can do that, and this is and Hitler is referring to these protocols when he's saying this that Jews can begin a world war. Yeah. So.
You want to say something?
Those are. I still think one, as a philosopher, needs to read word for word, because logically, and that's my reason for referring to Nietzsche, is that after 1945, Nietzsche was not read. He's difficult anyway, but he's interesting anyway. And he wasn't read. It took Walter Kaufmann and all of his efforts at Princeton and all the prestige there to put Nietzsche back in the canon. To this day, Nietzsche is only rarely taught. I happen to be teaching a course on Nietzsche now, but it's rarely taught at a PhD level. At any school, it's taught to undergraduates because damage control doesn't seem to be needed right there. And when it is taught, it's taught the genealogy of morals is taught. Nothing else is taught. All of the difficult stuff is, it's Habermas's word, contaminations. You want to, Habermas says, Nietzsche hat nichts Ansteckendes mehr. Nietzsche has nothing infective more, so we can read him because the Nazi plague has played itself out. Habermas's point, I think, though, can be instructive for us here. Will we wait 15 years, 20 years after these black notebooks to turn and read Heidegger again? If we, the implications, and it is the question of the consequence, what do we do? For a lot of people, they're already not reading Heidegger. For a lot of people, they are reading Nietzsche because they've forgotten that there's worse stuff there. When you start reading him, it's not a walk in the park. Nietzsche is tough on a lot of people, and especially if you're reading him as a feminist, because that's another question. You just really can't do that. So you would have to chuck it completely. If the parallel holds, then I think that when you say read Heidegger critically, that's what reading word by word does, and it means that you can bring the critical perspective you want to and you need to all of these texts. To proscribe Heidegger is, I think, what people do who simply say, and many people do, what are you teaching that Nazi for? And this is something that stands behind classes and what gets on a roster for undergraduate philosophy or political theory and so on. So it is not an idle issue. Politics do work in the academy, really, not just necessarily Obama politics, but who we teach. And one of the worries that I do have, we don't teach him much anyway. I mean, Heidegger is not taught very often as it is. So, and I don't know that apart from Peter, there are a lot of people in Germany that you could go to read Heidegger with at this point in time. I can go down a list of German universities, and I don't think I would find a lot of Heidegger specialists in Germany. So, also in the United States, we don't have lots of them. So, if we, in 10 years, have none of them, is that a loss? Maybe not. There's a lot of other people who can read Kierkegaard.
We read him but critically.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a long time. But just a quick question. I'd like to ask you a question about your other book on the Beiträge, for example. And I think, well, my curiosity is how this second work you're talking about here has allowed you to rethink your earlier work. extent would we be having a different conversation? Could you say something about that? And does this work you're talking about now require you a second addition to your Beiträge? And well, I guess it's probably a question to
That's a nice
contamination.
It's a very nice question, but I doubt that people are knowing my book about the Beiträge. But indeed, I wrote a small book about the Beiträge. And actually, it's a question. I consider myself in a certain way as a Heideggerian because I'm dealing with Heidegger for a long time. I was dealing with Heidegger for a long time. Now, it's of course a question what is the meaning of this experience reading these passages, reading the passages which will come at the end maybe of this year or beginning of the next year. And well, I say that I have to deal with it, and it's sometimes it's really painful. I have to admit it. It's painful. It's because that the problem is not that I'm morally shocked. Maybe it's not the first problem that I'm morally shocked, but it's also a problem that he is so dumb. That he is really. I found that Heidegger really is actually a clever and a smart guy, and you see that he's really dumb. He's just observe what he's writing there. And this is something what you have to swallow if you are now going on. That you see that, like all the others, he was not better actually, and you thought it actually long years. You thought that he's very clever, but no, he's not. And this is something what requires a certain critique, a certain distance, and I guess what probably requires every reading of a text. By the way, this I think is very important, that even in reading word by word, you shouldn't be too much in love with what you are reading. But we will be disappointed, like always.
I'd like to then ask you both just one final question, and then we will have a small reception and go on our merry way. Both of you have a stake in Heidegger. One runs the Heidegger Institute, and the other has written on it. Will you continue to teach Heidegger? And why?
Yes, of course. We'll teach Heidegger. Already in this semester, I'm teaching Heidegger. I'm teaching a lineage course by him because of figuring out this question of the narrative. How deeply rooted is it in Heidegger's thinking? Well, I guess there are many philosophical ideas in Heidegger who must be served for the future and who can be taught without a doubt on the basis of his fundamental ontology and so on. And then there are many ideas you can still teach. So in this respect, I will go on with dealing with Heidegger. Why? Yeah, because I think that his philosophical ideas are nevertheless very important, and that you really. But even if they are in a certain way problematic because of the pattern, you have to deal with it. You have to go through it. You have to live with these problems. But this is actually what philosophy is. That I guess that's even Arendt quote that philosophy is always dangerous. Philosophy must be dangerous. Thinking is dangerous. That's the point. It's the other Kierkegaard is too boring for me. It's not dangerous enough. So I guess that I will go on with this dangerous business.
teaching Heidegger when I get the chance, and that is, which I want to underline, because the value of Heidegger is in the way he changes what philosophy would be. And that for me is something Kierkegaard doesn't do, it's something that Husserl doesn't do. It is something which I think he got from Nietzsche, maybe bit off more than he could chew. I think he tried to imitate Nietzsche's style unsuccessfully. But Heidegger asks questions, and the idea of reading Heidegger with the critical spirit is Heidegger's own already. And one of the things that he warns us about is thinking that we know. It's also something that Strauss tells us about, it's something Plato tells us about, but it's our convictions, it's our prejudices which get in the way. If Heidegger can be indicted rightly for having participated in those prejudices of his day a little bit too much, a little too enthusiastically, and probably, and at least in my opinion, in an unforgivable way, it does not mean that someone who teaches us to question should be eliminated from the philosophical canon, because very few philosophers tell us to do that. Most philosophers tell us what is true. They insist on it, and your job is to learn to repeat that. What Heidegger teaches, and I think we've yet to learn, I'm still working on section 2 of Being and Time. I'm not very far. Would really be to question, and would really be to understand what's happening if we question. Because most of the time, we're not really questioning it. When someone asks you, how are you? You know they're not listening the moment you open your mouth to tell them. So, and then why? Because of Gadamer, because of my teachers, because of Richardson. I have a position in a life of other teachers who were on the wrong side of Heideggerian reception in the United States. That means I have, whether I like it or not, a certain responsibility to them, not just to me, not only to my students, some of whom are here, you're very patient, but also to the teachers, and also to people whose names, that's why I mentioned Goethe, because apart from a recent attention to Goethe, I think he was probably one of the most ignored literary theorists I know. So it's certainly someone who writes on technology. So it's for that reason that I would not stop. And I could translate that by also saying, I have no choice.
Yes, Heidegger is dangerous, you're right, and he asks questions unceasingly. 2 reasons to keep reading him, and I hope that these books, Embedded and the book that you've published, will be a spur for people to ask questions and continue to think dangerously as opposed to shutting down a conversation. I hope that's what we've tried to do tonight, and I wish you all to enjoy your libations, and then maybe thank you all very much. Thank you to the Goethe Institute for hosting us.